I had people call me up asking whether they should buy the new Speedmaster or the box set of the Speedmaster, the Railmaster. People who had only bought vintage, who collect vintage, because the aesthetics appealed to them, and they liked the idea of having this beautiful complete box set with everything that matched. And I'll be honest, my advice was don't, especially not with the box set, because it had Trilogy on the dial, which I thought was a terrible, terrible misfire. However, I do think that the individual pieces, for example, from Omega are very nice, particularly the Speedmaster, where it's been very, very smartly put together and all the proportions and everything are right. Those sort of things, if you're never going to, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to get a Speedmaster of that provenance and age in that condition on your wrist for less than 60 grand. But for 4,500 Swiss, or whatever it was, ex-tax, you could suddenly have that on your wrist, and you could enjoy some of the pleasure that someone who does own the original probably enjoys. And it's good for the vintage market, of course it is, because as we already touched upon, reissues always spark interest amongst those who want the originals. Yeah.
So my only concern, and it's a trend that's been certainly within Switzerland for 10 years or more, is that there's a lack of new ideas coming out of the big brands. It seems to be like those bands that get to a certain point in their career and all they ever do then is churn out recollected versions of their greatest hits. And you want to see somebody being bold and saying, no, we're going to produce a very contemporary, modern, new take on what a watch should look like. I think for a jeweler turned watchmaker, Bulgari are doing something very interesting in that way, because they're promoting a watch which looks extremely modern. Technically it's very good, and it's not referring to anything. But what everybody else seems to be doing is saying, what are the styles, the models that people are raving about? Let's bring them back again. And obviously the anniversaries is a prime key to hang all of this on. And so we can almost get our calendars out and plot Switzerland's production for the next 10 to 15 years by looking at when they launched, and 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, we will know what we're to expect, which I think is a shame. But having said that, I totally take your point, Silas, about it's an opportunity to wear a style, and we're back to seeing this as a style question, and possibly a reliability question, of something that you's no way within your grasp within the vintage or auction market. Not sure what I feel about fake loom though. That tanning or even slightly orange version, you kind of think, well, it would have started white or cream, and that artificial aging, I think, is a little kitsch. But I see why it's done, because we're as much in the style and fashion business now as
the lifestyle business
and the lifestyle business.
I mean, I have to say, I just to go back to what you're saying, I completely agree in the sense that I think we're seeing something that's almost a little tragic. It's like everything is planned a year or 2 years in advance in anticipation of the next bar, the next SIHH. The Swiss watch industry as a whole, as opposed to the other parts of the industry that have done well, or the specific markets like vintage and independent, we're seeing, they're having increasingly difficult times. And so in difficult years, obviously, the easier thing to do than develop a new movement is to develop a new dial and change some colors around and add a different colored bezel, etc., etc. I do think it's a sign of insecurity, possibly, unfortunately, and probably not a healthy sign for the future that so many of these brands are harking back to previous successes to be able to have surefire sales successes. But I guess it won't last forever. Perhaps it is a fashion thing that for the next couple of years we're going to see it, especially with the big numbers coming up anniversary-wise. But it is interesting what you talked about when you mentioned Bulgari. Other quote-unquote sort of fashion brands that have entered the watch industry in the last few years, actually, like Fabergé, are probably showing the most innovation, which I admire wholeheartedly. and they collaborate with independent brands, and they understand that there's a possible synchronicity there for movement design and so forth. So yes, vintage inspired, definitely what a lot of people want. Easy way to reach something that you would otherwise not be able to afford, and it's too infrequent to access. Too much of it, probably a bad thing.
Well, when you're looking at sales, you're looking at what's popular, and if you're looking at you're mentioning bands. I mean, you look at a busker in the street and they play something that everybody knows, and they're the ones that get the money, and the people who are playing their own stuff get nothing. So it's an easy way into the market, and I think it's
awful, essentially.
Totally.
Those of us who deal in the vintage watch market are creating the problem.
But I think you also have the need for something to be the future vintage watches, and maybe that is being bought on by the independent makers, and I think that might be somewhere that if you were collecting now might be a very interesting place to be looking.
Especially because a lot of the big brands will not look to support your vintage pieces after sort of 10, 15, 20 years. And if we're looking at 30 or 40 years time, you'll still be starting from scratch whether you've bought a big brand piece or launched out into an independent piece. And I just think, not even to the high-end independents, but some of the smaller brands who are just very clear on their house style will possibly be the vintage collection pieces of the future, because they have marched out on their own and said, this is who we are, this is what we're about, and we're not copying anything.
And they're probably stylistically more relevant now, so that will transport itself in the future when you're looking back and going, well, why do I want to buy a 1950s piece that was made in 2017? Why don't I buy a 2017 piece?